Hey guys, what's going on? Blaine back for another Netflix review, along with my friend Myron in the background, and today I'm going to be reviewing Bombay Rose. As far as I'm aware, Bombay Rose is the first animated movie to be released among Netflix's original titles this year, though the movie isn't really a Netflix original itself as it was made and released 2 years ago. It tells the story of Kamala, a flower seller who manages to escape an arranged marriage, and she eventually meets and falls in love with a Muslim orphan living on the streets named Salim. The story of this movie takes place in India, and as you might expect from this type of scenario, the romance between Kamala and Salim is strictly forbidden due to the conflicting religions between the two. So because they're not allowed to love each other according to dictated religious customs, they're forced to show their affection for each other by displaying them in all these kinds of animated dream sequences that are interspersed throughout the movie. And in these dream sequences, Kamala and Salim are usually depicted as sort of mythological figures. At least I think they're mythological figures anyway. I'm not 100% familiar with Indian culture, but a lot of what I see in these dream sequences are very reminiscent of what I've seen from paintings associated with India. And speaking of paintings, that's all I could think of when I was watching this movie, just how absolutely gorgeous and beautiful that this movie was. It was just an absolute feast for the eyes. From what I understand, every frame in this movie is completely hand-painted from scratch. There's no sort of computer generation that's put into this movie at all. What you see is 100% genuine craftsmanship. And I really love that movies like these are still getting made today. Too often we see computer generation that's being used as a substitute in place of traditional handmade animation effects. And there's nothing wrong with CG per se, but too often it's used as a crutch, and usually it just doesn't really end up looking that great in the long run anyway. And apparently for this movie it took 18 months to complete all the frames that were necessary in order to create this film. So just the sheer amount of dedication and work and effort that was put in making this film deserves recognition alone. And like I said, all the visuals in this movie are absolutely breathtaking. Just all the colors that are floating across the screen, especially in the dream sequences, and how they all intermingle together, and how characters fade from one part of the scene to another. There's just all sorts of crazy techniques that are going on, and it's just a very artistic film to look at. Everything about this movie was a technical marvel to behold, not just with the visual effects, but also with the music as well. I just really love what they did with the overall aesthetic style of this film. That being said, however, while I do love the artistry that went into this movie, the story for me personally didn't really strike home for me. It just felt completely flat. I didn't really notice it that much within the first 10 or 15 minutes or so, but as the movie went on and it progressed in its story, I started to realize that we don't really see any sort of relationship building between Kamala and Salim. Since it all mostly happens in the form of dream sequences, whenever we get to reality, we don't really see anything happening between the two of them. They're always next to each other and they always glance at each other, so they clearly acknowledge each other's presence, but because of their particular circumstances regarding their religions, they're never able to do anything. That part I 100% get, don't get me wrong, and I do like to a certain extent that they went into detail with that sort of thing. But at the same time, it was frustrating for me to watch a movie that's an hour and a half long and never really see any sort of real relationship or romance, anything like that happening between the two. In a lot of scenes in the movie, Kamala is on one side of the street and she's weaving these braids of flowers and selling them to passerby in the street, and then on the other side of the street we see Salim, who's selling bouquets. So they're both selling flowers. So you can look at flowers as sort of a motif for the love that they have for each other, and that's how they share a common bond with each other. In fact, the rose is something that pops up quite a bit. We often see Kamala on one side of the street as she's looking out to the other, usually looking at Salim doing some sort of crazy thing in order to get her attention. And he usually gives her a rose from a cemetery or a garden or something like that. He uses that as his way of giving affection to her without outwardly displaying so in the culture that he's immersed in. And a lot of the time we also see the camera's perspective shift inside the rose as it ends up traveling from point A to point B, which is usually wherever Kamala is situated in. So I like the fact that they had a symbol in place to represent the love between the two characters. In fact, you can often look at Kamala as being the Rose herself in some scenes. But apart from these motifs that are put in place, like I said, there's nothing that really happens between the two that leads me to believe that the two characters are truly falling in love with each other. Kamala and Salim barely say a word to each other at all whenever they're out on the street or wherever it is they happen to meet in real life. When they're in the dream sequences, it's a completely different story. They can't keep their hands off each other, and they're just traveling to all kinds of amazing hand-painted vistas, and you can see the visual representation of the love that they're experiencing together. And then when it goes back to boring, impoverished India, it's just not the same thing. It's just completely dull. There's nothing happening between the two. And I understand why nothing can really happen between the two, because the romance is supposedly forbidden. But that doesn't mean that you can't have a few scenes here and there that shows their relationship and affection for each other in complete privacy. The movie does start to get better and more focused in this regard toward the last half hour or so of the film. There's just more things happening in reality, and we see Kamala and Salim interacting with each other more properly this time around. Throughout the movie, there's a pimp who's associated with a nightclub that Kamala dances at along with the other troop of girls that's there. And he wants to sell her off to the highest bidder in Dubai, I think it was, as a maid, and obviously Kamala is doing her best to try and avoid that happening. I didn't really understand who he was supposed to be at the beginning, other than the fact that he was bad just because he had cliched filed teeth that looked like a vampire. But as the movie continued along and it started becoming more grounded in reality and stayed away from the more fantastical stuff, that's when I was able to start appreciating things a lot more. And then, before I knew it, the story was over. And I just felt so frustrated when this movie was over because I wanted more things to happen properly between Kamala and Salim. And I understand there's all sorts of thematic messages that you could take away from this, but at the end of the day, I just didn't feel that the romance worked for me in this movie. I wouldn't mind if there was like one or two of these animated sequences that happen in this movie, but we just don't really have enough scenes in this movie that are dedicated to developing Salim and Kamala's characters properly. All we know about Kamala is that she has a family structure that she can depend on, and she sells flowers. And there's a few bits and bobs here and there, but there's nothing really significant other than those things. We do get a bit more detail about Salim in terms of biography, but it's never really verbally explained so much as it is visually explained. There's like one scene where Salim is in his home village in wherever it was he's from. I don't know if the movie explained that. His parents were shot by terrorists, and he ended up coming to India as a result of that to want to escape the terrorists. At least that's how I interpret it when I saw that evidence taking place. If someone wants to prove me wrong, let me know in the comments below. There were also a lot of subplots in this movie that, while interesting in retrospect, also didn't really have any significant bearing on the main plot at hand, which was the romance between Kamala and Salim. There's a subplot involving this woman named Shirley D'Souza, and frequently we see her going into this antique shop, and she's often flirting with the owner there. And eventually she becomes less and less coy throughout the movie until it gets to a point where they go on a date with each other. And I really liked seeing that play out because we actually see the two characters interacting with each other in reality, and we see a relationship building between the two because of that. The fact that we saw evidence of these two characters coming together and bonding and developing a relationship with each other in real life as opposed to dream sequences is what ultimately made it work for me. There's a lot of other subplots going on in this movie, and they're all really interesting, but at the end of the day, they didn't really contribute to the main romance at hand that I really wanted to see more detail put into. Really though, it's not the fact that there's no detail put into the romance, because clearly whenever you watch this movie, there is a ton of depth and detail that's put into it, but I just personally felt that it was put in the wrong places. I feel like I'm gonna get lambasted in the comments for saying this, but I was very disappointed with this movie. It's definitely not a bad movie at all, I'll say that right now. You can tell just from looking at this movie, just one frame even, that there was a lot of love and passion that was put into this project. Everything from the painted visuals to the hauntingly beautiful intervals of singing that happens in between scenes, and just the overall look of the movie and how it depicts an impoverished Bombay, I thought was absolutely phenomenal. This movie is an absolute home run in terms of overall visual and audio aesthetics. But in terms of overall story, which for me personally is the most important thing in any movie, it left a lot for me to desire. Thematic content and motifs are great to a point, and I love when artists do try to put their stamp into a film in this way, but the most important thing is to get the story right and to have characters develop over the course of that story and have us be able to sympathize with them. And if that doesn't happen, then the story just doesn't work, and all the other details fall apart as a result. It's definitely a watchable movie for sure, though. If you love animated movies and you want to see something that's completely different from your average computer-generated flick, I highly recommend that you watch this movie. It is a visually impressive film, and I really cannot deny that, but as far as story was concerned, it left me wanting a lot more than what I got. Anyways guys, that's going to wrap up my review of Bombay Rose. Thanks for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed it, and as always stay tuned for the next part where next time I review the Spanish drama Coven of Sisters. Bye bye!